In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the flywheel assembly on your Troy-Bilt backpack blower. The harness is secured to the blower with 4 nuts. We'll go ahead and remove those. Now I can pull the harness away from the blower. Now I'm going to remove 1/2 of the impeller housing assembly. It's held in place with a series of screws. Now I have access to the impeller and I can remove it. It's held in place with 4 screws. Now I can remove the other half of the impeller housing assembly. It's secured to the rest of the blower with 4 screws on this side of the housing and 3 on the other side. Now I need to remove this clip from the inside of the impeller housing. This clip secures the throttle cable on the opposite side. I'll just use some pliers to squeeze the clamp back together and push it through the housing. And now I can pull the housing away from the blower. Now we have access to the flywheel and we can remove it. The problem is, when I try to remove the nut that secures the flywheel, it just spins the engine. So we need to bind up the engine. The easiest way to do this is to insert a short piece of rope through the spark plug hole into the cylinder. This will bind against the piston and keep the engine from rotating. Now remove the spark plug so I can insert the rope into the cylinder. Now that the engine's bound, I can remove the nut on the flywheel. Sometimes the flywheel will just pop right off the spindle. Other times it'll be a little stubborn, like this one is. A trick you can use to remove a stubborn flywheel is to thread the nut back on, but not all the way. You want to thread it on until the shaft is just below the surface of the nut. Then we'll take a hammer, I'll apply light force from the back of the flywheel and strike the nut with the hammer, and this should free the flywheel. Now you can install the new flywheel. You'll notice there's a keyway on the back of the flywheel. We need to line that up with the Woodruff key on the shaft. Now I'll apply a little bit of Loctite to the end of the spindle shaft and secure the flywheel with the nut. Now we can go ahead and pull the rope out of the cylinder and reinsert the spark plug. When you install a new flywheel, you'll need to reset the air gap between the flywheel and the ignition coil. I'll rotate the flywheel around until the 2 magnets on the flywheel line up with the 2 contact points on the ignition coil. Then I'll loosen the ignition coil mounting screws and now I can reset the distance between the flywheel and the ignition coil. To do that, I'll use an air gap gauge. If you don't have one of these gauges, you can usually use a business card, as it'll be about the same thickness. So I'm going to lift the coil away from the flywheel and insert the gauge in between the magnets on the flywheel and the posts on the coil. Now the gauge is holding that gap at the proper distance. I'll go ahead and tighten up the mounting screws and remove the gapping tool. Now I'll reattach the cable clip back to the other half of the impeller housing. Now I'll begin resecuring the impeller housing back to the motor. Now I can reinstall the 4 screws on the inside of the impeller housing. I'll want to put a little bit of Loctite on these screws. Now I can install the impeller. I'll want to use a little bit of Loctite on these screws. Now realign the hose with the impeller housing and reinstall the opposite side of the housing. And now secure the housing with the screws. And we'll finish up by reinstalling the harness.